So Genesis chapter 41 has 57 verses to it. And so the message is going to be a little bit fast-paced going through it just to make sure, but we want to cover the significance of everything that happens here. There's a lot to be gleaned here that we can apply to our lives today. But before we read it, and before I read all of it, just to bring us up to speed, up to date as to where we are in Joseph's life right now. Everything, it all relates, all of it. Joseph was given 2 dreams by God, revealing that the day would come when his family would bow down to him. This is significant because a lot of the things that ensued afterwards come based on his belief in these dreams. There's a confidence, and it's the same for us. When the scriptures reveal something that God has said that he will do, we need to make sure our lives are based on it. We can act confidently based on it. And this is the case with Joseph. Throughout his life, even though he couldn't see how they would possibly come to be, he operated based on this confidence. And it was that confidence that caused him to share what God had revealed to him. And it's that confidence that caused him to be able to remain focused in times of success and focused in times of trouble. It was God, what he knew about God, that God said was true. At the age of 17, his brothers, who were angered and hated him because of the dreams and because of his father's favoritism toward him, sold him into slavery. The response that he got for telling them the truth was persecution, which is the same thing that we are told that we will experience. After being bought by Potiphar in Egypt, Joseph experienced great success in the management of his household. This is often the case in our spiritual lives as well when we first come to Christ. It's a honeymoon period. We might experience times of great success, times of great peace. But it doesn't last. Not in a fallen world. During this time, while he was experiencing this great success, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife of attempting to rape her and was put in prison. Then while in prison, he was presented with the opportunity to interpret 2 dreams for 2 of the prisoners. All this happened as a result of his faith. Potiphar saw that God was with him because he talked about God. He gave glory to God, as we will see that he will do for Pharaoh as well. He knew that he was a servant of God. He demonstrated his faith during times of success. And then when he's in prison, the exact same thing. When the prisoners came to him looking for an interpretation of the dreams, he says, it's not I, it's God that can give the interpretation, and he gives it to them. Again, where's his focus? His reliance again is on God. It is God who is the source of all things. It is God who is glorified, not Joseph. It all happened as a result of his faith. And furthermore, in just refusing to succumb to the temptation with Potiphar's wife, again, a demonstration of his faith. What he had was far more valuable than anything that she could give. He maintained his faith, and God was with him throughout, using all that happened to him as part of his plan and fulfillment of the 2 dreams he gave Joseph while still in Canaan. Now, this doesn't mean that he's only with us when we are doing what's right and walking by faith. He never leaves us or forsakes us. But we abide in him, we follow him, because that's when we experience. He's pleased to work through those who are walking by faith. That's when we experience him acting in our lives. It's far better to see and experience the results of living faithfully rather than having to be disciplined by God for not living faithfully. Well, Joseph experienced the former. So this morning, 13 years after being sold into slavery, 13 years, we begin to see the fulfillment of Joseph's 2 dreams. Now, God was working all the way through everything up to this point, preparing it. But now we start to see the fulfillment, how he is going to fulfill the dreams that he gave Joseph while he was still in Canaan, that resulted in him being sent to Egypt. And what we will learn is that because Joseph walked by faith, he was ready. Because Joseph walked by faith, he was ready to respond in faith to God's activity in his life and be used by God for his glory. If our focus, if our mind isn't on the Lord at all, we're not ready for the activity of the Lord. We have no sensitivity to it. Joseph had a continual sensitivity to the activity of God in his life. He was ready. He was able to recognize opportunities that came his way and was able to respond in faith because he was walking by faith. And that's the same with us. It's why we're called to abide in him. It's how we'll be prepared. It's how we too will be ready. And this is what we're going to find, is this is all reinforced here. This is a thread throughout Joseph's entire life, which makes him such a strong example for us today. So follow along with me as I read the full chapter 41 in the book of Genesis. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears with thin, 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be known in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe." And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." And thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So, when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. You can't help but read that and conclude God's sovereignty. God is in control of all things. And if he isn't, why would we trust him? Why would we place our faith in God? Why would we have any comfort? Why would we have any peace? Why would we have any confidence in a God who doesn't control absolutely everything? There's a lot of things that we don't understand with regards to why he does it, why he does what he does. But what we can do, knowing God, knowing the character of God, knowing that he does it because it is good. And we see this. We even see in this story how everything is beginning to unfold. How everyone from the foreign lands has to come to Joseph personally in order to obtain grain. You know, God's plans are better than our plans. And that's the big thing that we had to learn when we went through and looked at the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At different times, they all thought that they needed to intervene on behalf of God to plan things out because they couldn't see very far ahead. And each time, it just produced a mess. It's when we trust him because we know him and believe what he has said that things work out well. And for me, I just said, that's what I want. That's the path I want to take. I don't want to have to go through a long period of time of discipline because I was being stubborn and focused on myself. I would rather experience what Joseph did. Go through the difficult times in faith and then seeing so clearly how he was acting in my life. So after interpreting the dreams for the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, Joseph spent another 2 whole years in prison. The translation to 2 whole years, the focus on the word whole, or 2 full years, is the same as 2 years of days. So exactly, it's measured in days, signifying exactly 2 years. Since the cupbearer and the baker were called before Pharaoh for their verdict on Pharaoh's birthday, this suggests that Pharaoh had his 2 dreams on his birthday 2 years later. We do not know if this is the case, but if it was the case, it would have most certainly elevated the dreams in significance in his mind. These are significant dreams, and would have added to the trouble that he was experiencing as a result of it being given on his birthday. This full 2-year period, since the cupbearer was restored to his position, was how much longer Joseph had to wait in prison. And again, this shows us that God works on his timeline for his purposes. He can't. Joseph could never know why God chose the timeline that he chose. He couldn't. Now later he could come to realize that, obviously it's because I'm going to be taken out of prison, not because of my innocence, but in order to do the will of God. And so he was reserving me for the time that he would give Pharaoh the dreams. That would become apparent. But beforehand, there's no way to know. But the reality is that he was sitting in prison, still ready and prepared for whenever the day would come. That's what Joseph's responsibility was, to be ready when God did act. We can't be ready unless we abide in him daily. Now, there'll be days, lots of ups and downs, but unless our mind is set on the Lord and he is the purpose for our life and we are seeking him, we are not going to be sensitive to him and or ready when he responds, when God acts. In Pharaoh's first dream, while standing by the Nile, he saw 7 attractive and plump cows coming up out of the Nile to feed in the reed grass. This was normal. This was a very normal picture. It's a nice dream. The cows would typically stand half submerged in the Nile as refuge from the heat and the flies, and then come up out of the water to feed on the rich grass growing in the fertile soil on the banks of the Nile. That's why the Nile was so valuable. It would go up and down, and it would make the land so fertile all around it. And the cows would come up and feed on the grass. So this is a good dream. This is normal. Nothing unusual about it at all. However, what was not normal, what was not usual, was that afterwards 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile and ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. What it means is they completely replaced them. They consumed them. This on its own would have been troubling to Pharaoh. However, the usage of cows in the dream would have increased his concern. This is because the cow was an emblem of the Egyptian goddess of fertility, Isis. A plump, good, healthy cow was the emblem of Isis, representing fertility. So this had some significant meaning for him. Furthermore, the Egyptian god of vegetation and the underworld, Osiris, was represented by a great bull with 7 cows. 7 cows. So for us, we read this and go, okay, we don't gain the significance of it as Pharaoh would. This is challenging everything. This is something that's going to happen that's more powerful than what his gods are. So when Pharaoh saw 7 healthy cows in the dream being consumed by 7 ugly and thin cows, it would have strongly indicated that Egypt's prosperity was under threat. I mean, not just their prosperity, their entire faith system under threat. So no doubt this would cause Pharaoh to awake from his sleep. Just like any bad nightmare dream we get, we wake up. Well, it must have still been in the middle of the night because Pharaoh fell asleep again. And this time, he dreamed a second time. He saw 7 ears of grain, plump and good, growing on one stalk. Then after them he saw that 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, had sprouted and swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. So this is the same. It's the same message. The bad, inedible crop replaced the good crop. Just as the ugly, thin cows that were probably inedible, essentially, replaced the plump, good, healthy cows. The dream must have seemed real for Pharaoh because when he awoke, it says he realized it was a dream. The vividness of the dreams and their close relationship between each other, along with the symbolism in them, the religious symbolism in them, caused Pharaoh's spirit to be troubled, which I would say is probably an understatement. He was worried. Given that he was ruler over Egypt and that the dreams were considered to be predictive of the future, he would have been concerned for the well-being of Egypt. He would have been concerned for his own throne. Something threatening was on the horizon, and he wanted to know what it was. He needed to know what it was. He was desperate to know what it was. So in the morning, he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and its wise men. Not just a few, all of them. He called them to interpret his dreams. He was desperate to know. The magicians were from the priestly caste and relied on their knowledge from books written by the Egyptians about magic. That included the topic of dreams. So they were consulted with, because of their knowledge of these books, to tell him, based on what the books said, what those dreams meant. The wise men were relied on to use their wisdom to determine the meaning and application of mysteries and spiritual things. So you had all the bases covered, at least from a human perspective. I mean, today, many look to astrologists, fortune tellers, and the New Age practitioners for this. There's no difference. It's the same thing. Trusting in man and the wisdom of man in order to be able to understand something that only God can reveal because it was from God. After telling them of his dreams, unsurprisingly, there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Now, I don't know how many all means, but it's a lot. There wasn't anyone in the entire land, the entire priestly caste system, and also all the wise men, none of them had a clue. They didn't even take a stab at it. This is because the books, magic practices, and wisdom of man cannot discern God's activity. And we are told this in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 2:14-16. Only those who are spiritually discerned can do this, because they are gifted the ability by God. This is why Joseph would say it could only come from God, but he gave him the gift of being able to discern. And it's the same with believers today. Believers understand spiritual things because they're spiritually discerned, because the Holy Spirit has made them spiritually discerned. Unbelievers can't. The spiritual things are folly to them. They don't have an appreciation for it. It's kind of the picture here. As such, there was no one Pharaoh could call on who had the spiritual discernment to interpret dreams from God. He's essentially in the exact same predicament that the chief cupbearer and the chief baker were in prison when they didn't have access to any of the magicians or any of the wise men. He was in the exact same. God levels things out. He's humbling Pharaoh here. So although Pharaoh believed himself to be divine and all-powerful, we see how easily humbled he was by God with just 2 dreams, with no way to understand what they meant. This demonstrates that all the rulers and nations of the world are completely subject to God's sovereignty and control. And oh, is this something we should remember today? Every ruler in this world, no matter how evil, how good, is under God's control. Every nation, no matter how powerful or how weak, how influential, is under God's control. Believers can live in this world with confidence because it is under God's control. We're on solid ground while the rest of the world is on shaky ground, shifting ground. We need to remember that with all the world events. God's in control, and He's got a purpose in these things that are happening, even though we might not be able to understand them at the time or know why at the time. But what we can know is that God's will is being done. Just as Joseph, we can look back at Joseph's life and see how God's will was being done. Due to the chief cupbearer's closeness to Pharaoh and the daily contact he had with him, he became aware of Pharaoh being troubled over the dreams and the failure to obtain an interpretation for them. And it was at this time that the chief cupbearer remembered Joseph. It just fits together. Although he remembered his offenses against Joseph for forgetting him, he feels bad about it. He didn't do it intentionally. It was God who caused him to forget. It was God who caused him to remember at the time he gave Pharaoh the dreams. He was keeping Joseph in prison, reserving him for this exact moment. God did not want Joseph to appear before Pharaoh to plead his innocence, to justify himself. And again, there's nothing wrong with wanting justice. Every single one of us should desire justice. But that's not why God was releasing him from prison. And for many of us in our lives, He is not going to give us justice on this side of eternity. He wanted Joseph to appear before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams as a witness of God. Again, this tells us that God's timing and purposes are to accomplish His will, not ours. His will, not ours. And we have to continually make the adjustments in our minds to make sure we have the right mindset when we're going through difficulties. The cupbearer explained to Pharaoh about Joseph interpreting both his and the baker's dreams and how they came about exactly as interpreted. However, in the recounting this to Pharaoh, he neglected to tell him that Joseph attributed the interpretations to God. Go back to chapter 40, verse 8. He told him as well, it's God that will give them the interpretations. As such, Pharaoh had the understanding that Joseph had this power, not God. And so Pharaoh was thinking, he's the one that's going to be able, by his own power, Joseph's power, is the one that's going to be able to help me. He's going to be like one of the magicians or the wise men, but better than them. I mean, just a thought that comes to my mind. If you got the most powerful man in the world calling you before him and he pays you a compliment like that, often the temptation is to say, yeah. But that's not what Joseph does. Because he's not looking for his glory. He's looking for God's. He will only be satisfied with God working through him, not seeing what he can do. Pharaoh was so desperate to have his dreams interpreted that he decides to call on a foreign slave in prison. We just need to let that sink in. He's going to rely on a foreign slave in prison. So he arranged for Joseph to be quickly brought out of the prison, cleaned up and appropriately dressed in order to come before him. So in one day, Joseph goes from languishing in prison to appearing before the most powerful ruler in the entire world. He may have thought that the cupbearer talked to Pharaoh and that he finally decided to hear from him about his innocence, or he may have been told in advance why. But we don't know. We're not told at all. We're just told that he came in one day. Maybe it took a day to clean up. I don't know. But one day. He had to be ready. So what we do know is how quickly it happened. He was ready, in season and out of season, to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching, which we're exhorted to do in 2 Timothy 4:2. And it's exactly what Joseph does. Pharaoh immediately begins by telling Joseph he had a dream and that he had been informed that when Joseph hears a dream, he can interpret it. Okay, just picture here. He's been called up out of prison, just cleaned up, given new clothes and everything like that. Pharaoh's relying on him. He's standing before the most powerful man in the world who can decide to put you to death for the simplest little offense. And what does Joseph do? He corrects him. He corrects Pharaoh. Because Joseph serves one far more powerful and greater than Pharaoh. We need to remember that in our lives. Joseph's response was to correct Pharaoh by telling him, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Only a man of faith, walking by faith, seeking to honor God for his glory, would be ready to confidently and boldly correct the most powerful man in the world in his own court by pointing to God when he didn't believe in God. Doesn't that sound like what we're called to do in proclaiming the gospel? All the components are there, including the potential cost that could come from Pharaoh responding negatively to it. What this shows us is Joseph's faith. It shows his courage, his boldness, and humility because he knew God. He believed God. Thus, he was a witness of God, whatever the cost may have been. He wasn't focused on the cost. He was focused on God. He was trusting him, which is exactly what we're called to do as servants of Jesus Christ. We are called to do exactly the same thing. Joseph is an example for us. It's just in this case, he's standing before the most powerful man in the world. But he wasn't worried about what he thought of him, thinking that he might be able to arrange for himself to get a good position or anything like that. He was only thinking about honoring God. That's because he was ready. It is worth noting that Joseph does not even attempt to barter with Pharaoh to get his freedom in return for the interpretation. It's like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. God's going to give it, but I would like to be released from prison. He didn't do this because his focus was on God and his glory. This is why he tells Pharaoh that only God will give him a favorable answer. The word favorable is interesting. It's the word translated, it's the word shalom, which means peace. But it even goes beyond that. It means wholeness, completeness, well-being. It's a comprehensive word that literally means, what's best for you. I wish what's best for you. He wishes it's peace. Joseph is telling Pharaoh that only God can give him the peace he seeks. Isn't that the message for us? Only God can give you, Pharaoh, the peace that you seek, to relieve the troubles that you are having over these dreams. Only God can do that. And it's the same for us in our lives. Only God can give us peace. Again, this is the same message God has given us to proclaim through Jesus to others. And like Joseph, it requires faith, courage, boldness, and humility. Again, he is not a prideful man. We must put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace, as it says in Ephesians 6:15. We're called to do the same thing. 1 Peter 3:14-15 says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, which Joseph most certainly did, you will be blessed, which Joseph most certainly was. Have no fear of them. He didn't. He had courage. Nor be troubled. He wasn't troubled. He was confident. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. What was Joseph doing all these years leading up to it? He was honoring the Lord as holy. That's the reason why he was able to rebuff the advances of Potiphar's wife. And it goes on, the Apostle Peter goes on to say, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Joseph is an example of this. He has a hope. And he essentially points Pharaoh to that hope. God's the only way you're going to have peace, Pharaoh. And for us today, the only way we'll have peace is through Jesus Christ. The only way we can honor Christ is if we are walking by faith, seeking his will and his glory, not ours. This is how Joseph was ready. This is what made him a witness in all circumstances, good circumstances and bad circumstances. Whereas people saw that everything that was happening, Potiphar, the keeper of the prison, as well as the cupbearer and the baker, they knew it was God. God that gave Joseph whatever success he had. Because Joseph repeatedly pointed them to God. So now, knowing that it would be God who would interpret his dreams, Pharaoh tells the dreams to Joseph. And in doing so, he actually refers to them as one dream. Pharaoh seems to recognize at this point that the dreams were communicating the same thing and would have the same interpretation. They're very closely related. In recounting the first dream, Pharaoh adds some of his own analysis to what he saw. He says that he had never seen such poor and very ugly and thin cows in all the land of Egypt. Never. This was something that was so stark, he had no previous experience. He had nothing to compare it to at all. That would have added to the trouble. And then he says that after they ate the first 7 plump cows, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Now, what happens if, in fact, you're thin and you have a really good meal or a bunch of meals? And there would have been a lot of meals. You typically show it. You become plump. You get better, stronger, healthier looking. These cows couldn't be made healthy. He saw that nothing could be done to make the ugly, thin cows healthy. Nothing. That would have added to his trouble. In recounting the second dream, he emphasized that the full stalks were good, and the thin and blighted stalks, he added that they were withered. They were inedible. These additions by Pharaoh show that the dreams had a deep and fearful impression on him. He had a sense of their significance. So Joseph, upon hearing it, doesn't say that there was any time in between. He immediately responds by confirming that the dreams are indeed one dream. So he's right. And that God, notice he says God. He was just not dreams that just came from nowhere. God was revealing to Pharaoh what he is about to do. I'm telling you, and I'm going to do it, and there's nothing you can do about it. In all this, Joseph points to the sovereignty and power of God, which Pharaoh could do nothing about. He immediately identifies God as the source of the dream and that he would be the one who brings it to pass. Joseph then after laying that out, Joseph interprets the dream. He says, 7 good years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt will be followed by 7 years of very severe famine that will consume the land, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. Afterward, he repeats that God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do, and adds that the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will bring it about shortly. God has shown Pharaoh. God has fixed it. God will do it shortly. Everything is God. Everything. It's all about God. This emphasizes that Pharaoh has no power to stop it. God is sovereign and all-powerful, not Pharaoh. Not at all. This is what is being revealed here in the interpretation of the dreams and by Joseph. It is of note that the interpretation given by God was not a favorable answer in the sense of what Pharaoh would have wanted. We don't have peace when we get everything that we want. We have peace when we respond to God and what He reveals. It was a negative answer, telling him a great famine was coming on the land and that there was absolutely nothing that he could do to stop it. It's not the type of interpretation I would have. It's almost more like the interpretation that was given to the baker in prison. As bold and difficult as this answer was, it was the truth. As bold and difficult as this answer was, and it was given in gentleness and humility, in respect, it was the truth. And as we will see, it is only when we accept the truth that we can properly respond to the truth. And it is only when we properly respond to the truth that things turn out well, that we have hope. Critical. What happened here in the court of Pharaoh is exactly what we're taught in the New Testament for ourselves. The truth matters. It must be told. Because only when we know the truth can we respond to the truth, and only when we properly respond to the truth that we have hope. As such, as any good prophet would do at this point, Joseph applies the interpretation and gives a recommendation for action. So here you got the context, you got the content, you got the interpretation, and now you have the application. He's a good preacher. He recommends that Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt, and to appoint overseers over the land to assist him in collecting 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. It would be a 20% tax on the produce of the land to be saved and kept in storage under the authority of Pharaoh to be distributed during the 7 years of famine. This ability to apply what God revealed to him came from the wisdom God gave him. In the New Testament, it's called the spiritual gift of the utterance of wisdom, or the word of wisdom, which is the ability given by God to properly apply what has already been revealed by God, which we have in His Word. It's not new revelation. It's not some special note to us to pass on to others. It's how we apply what God has already revealed to us. That's exactly what Joseph is doing here. Pharaoh needed to select a discerning and wise man because there needed to be a centralized plan to face the severity of the coming famine. He would have to communicate to the people about the famine. He would have to explain the plan to prepare for it. He would have to properly and fairly implement and administer the plan. And he would later have to ration and distribute the food. This takes wisdom. Such a large and comprehensive program run by a powerful man that required a 20% tax would most certainly be at risk to corruption and mismanagement. Tyrants love these situations. Dictators love these situations. So it needed a man who was discerning and wise to run it in order to gain trust, to gain the support, and to gain the cooperation of the people. That's a good leader. Joseph wasn't giving this advice because he saw himself as the person for this position. He wasn't trying to create a position for himself. He was an imprisoned foreign slave. He was only 30 years old. He had absolutely no political experience, and he had no desire to elevate himself. He only wanted to see God elevated. He has demonstrated that throughout his entire life. He's not writing for himself a job description so that Pharaoh can say, oh yeah, you're the one for it. He's just telling them the truth. He's just applying the wisdom that God's given him the gift of. Given his wisdom, along with the relatively small and minor experience of administering Potiphar's household, Joseph simply knew what was required. I mean, this all came. He didn't go off and sit and think for a year to come back with the plan. This followed the interpretation. He knew. This is a gift given to him by God, bringing glory to God, which Pharaoh would see and understand. The point here is that his status, his age, and experience meant nothing to Pharaoh. Oh, a lot of people, young people searching for jobs today would love to hear that, right? Where everything is all about status or education or experience. But in God's economy, that doesn't mean anything. It can be useful, but that's not the primary thing. Those aren't the primary things. All that mattered was that Joseph had the Spirit of God, who gave him the discernment and wisdom to interpret the dreams and present such a good proposal. What a witness! Pharaoh saw it. He chose him because he had the Spirit of God. He was empowered by God. He's acknowledging God because of Joseph's bold witness of God. It was Joseph's reliance on and witness of God that led to his appointment. Thus, since he proved faithful with little, God gave him much. But keep in mind, he didn't do it expecting it, which is a big problem today with the goofy theology that's out there that you kind of do to get. No. He wasn't looking for what he could get. He was just being faithful. And because of it, the little, and because of that, God entrusted him with much. This is actually the similar story to Daniel. If you read through Daniel chapter 5. Except Daniel actually described the dream, didn't just interpret it. But what this tells us is that God is pleased to work through those walking by faith. Why is it that he was calling Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and us all to trust him? Because that's how God chooses to use them. Well, Joseph trusted him. Joseph was placed over Pharaoh's house, much bigger than Potiphar's, I'm sure, and over all the land of Egypt, where all his people will order themselves as he commands. Wow, that's authority, that's power. Only Pharaoh would be greater than him. Only Pharaoh. Pharaoh then establishes Joseph's authority by taking his signet ring from his hand and putting it on Joseph's hand, clothing him in garments of fine linen and putting a gold chain about his neck, and parades Joseph behind him. in his second chariot, calling out to the people to bow the knee before him. Pharaoh then said to Joseph that without his consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So just as Joseph was humble when he was given the coat by his father, he now wears his new garments with humility. Since he was not an Egyptian, he was given an Egyptian name and given an Egyptian wife. His new name, Zaphenath-Paneah, is interpreted as meaning God speaks and he lives. There are other interpretations denoting him as the nourisher of the land and actually savior of the people. His wife Asenath was the daughter of a prominent Egyptian priest. So this, along with his new name, would reinforce his status in Egypt, which was important for the carrying out of his responsibilities. He was one of them. He wasn't just a foreigner. They could obey him. Joseph immediately went through all the land of Egypt to plan, organize, and implement his plan. Now, I'm kind of reading into it at this point in time. It doesn't say he went back to his own little, maybe side palace, second palace, and just kind of enjoyed it for a little bit and pranced around and liked his new position. No, it appears here he just got straight to work. He was called by God, and he immediately employed himself in the service of God. God made the first 7 years so plentiful that they could not measure the 20% tax they gathered. It was too much to measure. This would have made the 80% the people kept greater than what they had ever experienced before the tax, which would have made it a whole lot easier to pay the tax. It's amazing how God provides, how he went before Joseph in ordering things. Joseph showed his wisdom by ensuring the grain from the fields around every city was stored in every city. It wasn't taken away from the city to a centralized place where the people couldn't see it or know if they'd ever see it again. By keeping it stored in the cities, the people could see that it would be available to them during the coming famine. It would have just increased their trust. Transparency. During the 7 plentiful years, 2 sons were born to Joseph, with Asenath his wife. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. He still loved them, as we'll see before. It's not like he didn't forget them. But what it reveals here is that for a long time, Joseph was troubled by all he suffered in the past, including from his brothers. Up to this point, it bothered him. He carried that weight. However, given God's activity in his life and his success in preparing for the famine, he was beginning to see how God meant it all for good, which is what he would say in chapter 50, verse 20. It seems that beginning to see, hey, I can see how this is all going to work, especially remembering the dreams. Now he can see what the context would be for his brothers bowing down before him, and his father and his mother. The name of his second son he called Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Those two, fruitful in the land of his affliction. Look, we go through life and we experience affliction, but we can be fruitful. And Joseph shows us how. This reveals that although Joseph experienced great affliction in Egypt, God was still with him and made him fruitful. We need to remember this. Every single one of us is going to experience differing degrees of affliction in this life. But God doesn't leave us. He doesn't forsake us. We need to trust him because we know who he is, and he will produce fruit. Not us. He will. It's exactly what he did in Joseph's life. It was all from God. All Joseph had to do was be faithful, remain faithful, and be ready, which is what we're called to do, and we'll see that in a few minutes. Both their names were Hebrew names, showing Joseph's faith in God in spite of his hardship and affliction. They weren't Egyptian names, they were Hebrew names. As the second most powerful man in Egypt, he gives them Hebrew names. Their Hebrew names, Joseph's faith, and that they were raised with faith in God, would be an indication that his Egyptian wife also had faith in God. Just as a side note, there's a widely translated novel written as early as 200 BC called Joseph and Asenath that includes the conversion of Asenath to faith in God. But we don't know. It's a novel. We don't know. It's not scripture. Whether accurate or not, it shows that she has long been considered to have had faith in God. But we can see right here in Scripture, and the fact that they would become two tribes used in God's redemptive plan, there's no reason to believe that she wasn't a believer. The 7 years of plenty came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. It was so severe that it affected all lands. Due to Joseph's work, Egypt was the only land where there was bread. When the people of Egypt cried to Pharaoh for bread, he directed them to Joseph and to do what he says. Joseph did such a good job for the first 7 years that Pharaoh's confidence in him was maintained, or even it grew. Now it was time, there was Joseph and Joseph alone that would make all the decisions. He had full and complete authority. Once the famine impacted the whole land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And this would have required great discernment and wisdom. He had to set the price, have a plan for those who could not pay, ration and distribute it fairly, prevent abuse and fraud, and, as mentioned before, ensure it lasted for 7 years. And then compounding this complexity was having to deal with the many, many foreigners coming to Egypt to buy grain. It is this later responsibility that would bring him in contact with his brothers again. The fact that Pharaoh said, "Go to Joseph." So, when people came from other lands, they had to go to Joseph. He would negotiate with them. This again shows us how God is always in control. He will do what he says he will do. We can trust him and live our lives based on that trust, which is what Joseph did. So how do we look at this for ourselves? I mean, there's lots of application for us throughout this. But it's very common for people today to deny the faith or to fail to walk by faith during times of both success and tribulation. Either by forgetting God and trusting in themselves and the world, especially during times of success, or by blaming God and concluding he is not who he says he is because he's not meeting our expectations. The problem isn't God. The problem's us. God's character doesn't change. What Joseph demonstrates for us is that what faith is, and what it looks like to walk by faith. Patiently trusting God, knowing he will do as he said in spite of how good or bad the times are. It is what allowed him to be ready to act as a witness of God at all times and all circumstances, regardless of the cost. In this, he was indeed a type of Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Although God elevated Joseph during his life, it was not what Joseph was looking for. He wasn't looking for a temporal reward. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 says this, "By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites in the future and gave direction concerning his bones." What would he be worried about? What would happen after his death for if he didn't have hope that transcended life? Joseph had the same eternal hope that Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob had before him. Those are the names that appear in Hebrews chapter 11 up until his name. There's many who have followed. Joseph's hope was after death. It was for a better country, a heavenly one. And then listen to what it says. "Therefore God's not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." Why? That's what God has promised us. Glorification is the last part of our salvation. And when we rejoice in our salvation, we are expressing confidence that the day is coming when he will glorify us. We are to have this mindset among ourselves. Some of us may experience success and justice in this life, and most certainly should celebrate when it does, but we can't allow it to distract us, just like it didn't distract Joseph. But it's not success and justice in this life that we should be looking for. Many others will not experience success and justice in this life, but instead receive only persecution and even death. That's how Hebrews 11 ends. In both cases, whether or not we experience success or not, believers are looking forward to receiving the guaranteed, incomparable glory in eternity. That's where our hope is. That's why we rejoice. That's why we praise God. But in the meantime, even though we cannot fully understand how or why things must happen as they do, we don't need to know. We just need to know God. We can have the confidence that all things are intended for our good in preparation for our glory. This is the mindset in which we must approach each day of our lives in all of our circumstances. It is how we too will be ready, both to be used by God to face death, or for his appearing to take us to be home with him. And in this is where we find our joy. We're happy in this because it's not an external condition. It's an internal condition, which is exactly what Jesus taught us in the Beatitudes. Blessed are you, happy are you. When we rest in the work of God, the promise of God, his internal work, what he's doing inside of us, regardless of what's going on around us.